we go. Okay. So we want to welcome everyone to our Extension Explorers. Preserving apples is our topic for today. A few reminders as we begin. This session is being recorded, so if you choose not to have your picture on the screen, you may go to the stop video there, and that will eliminate your actual picture being on the video. Please make sure your microphone is on mute, and we'll have time at the end for any questions that you may have. You may also place your questions in the chat along the way, and we will work to get those answered during the discussion as well. So today, I am presenting. My name is Anita Eichler. I am with UT-TSU Extension in Cheatham County. And with me is Patsy Watkins, and she is with the UT Extension office in Williamson County. So we're excited to be with you today and to talk about preserving apples. Let's get started. I love apples for the fact that it reminds me of the fall and family and fun activities outside. I thought it might be fun if we do a little bit of trivia and before we begin and learn just a little bit more about apples. So we're going to have a little bit of apple fun facts, and you can put your answers in the chat if you would like. And my first question is, what is the only native apple to North America? Anyone know that? Native apple to North America. I don't see anyone in the chat yet. The answer is, get my screen to change out. The crab apple is the only apple native to North America. Does anybody have an idea of how many varieties of apples are grown in the United States? I'll give you a minute to put your guess in the chat box. Patsy says 150, April says 35. There are actually 2,500 varieties of apples that are grown in North America. So if we grow 2,500, how many varieties do you think are worldwide? So across the world, how many do you think? I'll give you a minute to put that in the chat. 10,000, 7,000. Patsy's pretty close. 7,500 varieties are grown throughout the whole world. So lots of varieties of apples, lots of flavors, textures that we can explore and learn from that help play into, and we're going to talk a little more about what varieties work best for different products that you're wanting to make. All apples aren't the same. So, you know, that adage of comparing apples to apples, well, that may not be the best adage as well. So we hear the saying, I love you for a bushel and a peck. How much does a peck weigh? I'll give you a few minutes to guess that. How much is in a peck? So a peck actually weighs about 10.5 pounds. Anybody know how much a bushel weighs? A bushel actually weighs somewhere between 42 and 48 pounds, depending on the apple and the texture of that apple. So one last question, then we're going to move into our actual presentation on preserving apples today. How many states grow apples? So in the United States, how many of those actually grow apples? I'm not seeing any at 50. April says 50. She's right. All 50 states have a form or a variety of apples. However, 36 of those states actually grow apples on a commercial basis. So thinking on that as we go. So just thought that would be a fun way to kick off our discussion this morning. So what's our pleasure? There are many ways to enjoy preserving apples for the fall, and we have just a few items listed here. There's lots of apple spreads, apple preserves, apple jelly, apple butter. You could do a conserve or a marmalade. There's relishes, spiced crab apples, spiced apple rings, sweet apple relish, apple juice, apple sauce, apple cider. So a huge variety of ways that we can enjoy our apples in the fall. I have down below the website for our Bedford County office. Whitney Danhoff has done just an amazing job putting together a resource for our Extension Explorers topics. And so if you visit Extension Explorers Food Preservation there, you will find lots of wonderful apple recipes there that you can use and participate in and being able to enjoy some of those apples along the way. So what I want to do today is talk about a little bit of tips on choosing those apples and some tips on some of our more common apple preserve areas. So the first thing is we want to make sure that we choose the correct variety. And we talked just a minute ago about all those different varieties out there. You may choose your apples from the orchard, from the grocery store. You may go in your backyard and pick apples from there, but you want to choose a preservation method that kind of matches up to the best for the apple variety that you're choosing. So if you visit the Bedford County site, and I'm also going to type it in the chat, but there is a chart that you can utilize that helps you choose the best varieties for the type of apple preserve that you are going to use. And it's from pickyourown.org /apple varieties to choose. And I will come in and put that in the chat in a few minutes while Patsy's talking. So you'll be able to have that link. Now, we don't necessarily support all the information on the Pick Your Own site, simply because we have not gone through the whole site to make sure it matches up with our university standards. But the chart was a fabulous way to learn what are some of the best apples to choose along the way. After selecting the appropriate variety, you need to make sure that you select the best apples from that variety. So you want to look for things like bruising, cracking. If your apple is soft, it will be more mealy and have an overripe flavor. So you want apples that have a good firm feel to them, that they're a little bit hard, so that you get a better product at the end when you're working there. So just watch for those defects. Now, some apples have little brown spots that appear all over them. That's okay. That's not going to affect the flavor or the quality of your product. Those little brown spots are called russeting, and they come very natural to the apple. And so we don't have to worry about that, but we're talking about larger bruised markings or obvious molding and so forth that might go along with that. If you must store your apples prior to being able to preserve them, you want to be aware that a cool, dark place is best for longevity of your apple products. They should not be tightly covered or wrapped tight. A perforated plastic or an open paper bag are your best options for storing. Even a basket or a wooden crate can be a great way to store your apples. If kept in the refrigerator, they should be placed in the humidifier compartment or in a plastic bag that has some holes punched in it. So that will prevent the loss of moisture and crispness along the way. Apples should not be placed close to foods with strong odors because they tend to pick up on those odors and those flavors, and that will taint your flavor and the quality in your product. We have to always address our safety reminders as we go through. Again, if you've been on several of our sessions, you know that we really encourage you using a tested recipe that's going to come from one of your universities or one of your best options, especially online, or you can order a hard copy, is through the USDA National Center for Home Food Preservation. They have lots of recipes and tips, hints along the way that may help you be able to find exactly what it is you're looking for. They also produce a food preservation book called So Easy to Preserve. That's another tested form to be able to use. We also want to make sure that when you're putting up your apple preserves, that you're using safe equipment. Our apples are usually high acidity, so we can usually use a water bath canner or a steam canner. But if your recipe calls for a pressure canner, you always want to make sure that you use the proper canner that your recipe is calling for. You also want to make sure that you're using two-piece lids and you're using tempered jars that are made specifically for canning, because that's going to be able to withstand the high heat that you use in canning. And make sure that all of your equipment is washed and sanitized prior to using your surfaces, your utensils, and that helps keep us safe and healthy along the way. So let's talk about applesauce. Applesauce is one of those simple recipes that we can use that can be fun to make with your children as well. So some possible varieties to choose. You want to choose sweet, juicy, and crisp apples. So we suggest maybe Fuji or Gala are considered some of the best apples. Cameo, Ambrosia, Autumn Crisp, Ginger Gold, Golden Delicious, John Gold can be other options there. If you like a little more tart flavor, you can add 1 to 2 pounds of tart apples to each 3 pounds of a sweeter apple. And that'll just give you a nice variance in your flavor. So when deciding how many apples you need, an average of 21 pounds is needed to get a canner load of about 7 quarts, and an average of about 13.5 pounds is needed per canner load for pints. And remember, a bushel weighs somewhere between 42, 48 pounds. So it's going to yield about 14 to 19 quarts of applesauce, which averages about 3 pounds per quart. A couple tips. With your applesauce, you may or may not use sugar. You may sweeten to the desired flavor. Remember, with our product, your spices, your herbs, those things are fine to swap out, to add a little extra, to take out, but we never want to alter our product. So if a recipe calls for 3 pounds of apples, we want to make sure that we have used the correct amount of apples in our product, but our sugar, spices, herbs, we can alternate on those. For a smoother consistency, be sure to run heated apples through a sieve or a food mill. But if you like a chunkier consistency, leave out that step and you'll have a little thicker, richer applesauce. So again, we get to use our creativity and make things the way that we would enjoy them. Let's talk a little bit about apple butter. Again, an average of about 8 pounds is needed per canner load to get 9 pints of apple butter. For best quality, we suggest using Jonathan, Winesap, Stamen, Golden Delicious, or McIntosh apple varieties. A few tips to know when your apple butter is done. You can take a teaspoon, dip out some of the apple butter, remove it from the heat, and let it set for a minute or two. If it holds its shape, then your apple butter is ready to preserve. If it loses its shape, then you need to be able to cook it down a little longer. You may also put it on a saucer, and if there becomes a little pool of liquid around your apple butter, it needs to be processed a little longer. But again, if it holds its shape and it's not leaking liquid, then your apple butter is ready to process. And again, there are reduced sugar methods for apple butter. However, a lot of times your reduced sugar methods do not have as long of a shelf life. Their quality reduces much quicker. So if you're going to use the reduced sugar method, you may want to make a smaller batch to begin with and explore to find what you enjoy and how long that shelf life is going to be, because we don't want to throw any of it out and lose any of that along the way. Let's talk a little bit about apple cider. There are 2 forms of apple cider in the United States. Fermented alcoholic apple juice is called hard cider, while freshly pressed non-alcoholic cider is called sweet cider. Cider is made from fermenting the apple juice, which relies on natural yeast present in the apples for fermenting. Fresh or unpasteurized apple juice or cider can cause foodborne illness. So we want to be more alert to that. If you're going to make cider at home, you're going to want to be extra cautious on following those safety tips. Young children and elderly and immune compromised individuals are going to be the ones most affected by that fresh apple cider. And one of the things that you want to make sure you follow is to pasteurize that cider at about 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you're going to pour it into warm jars. That will prevent the breakage. But that pasteurization is a very important step if you're going to make cider at home. So you want to avoid using apples that have visible signs of decay or mold growing. Wash your apples thoroughly before pressing or grinding to make the cider. Use a fruit press or a small kitchen appliance to crush the fruit. You want to also make sure that you start by washing your hands, sanitizing all of your equipment. We recommend washing and rinsing your utensils in a mixture of 1 tablespoon household bleach per gallon of water for at least 1 minute. Once you've pressed your apples, you'll want to squeeze those through a clean, damp muslin cloth. You may also use a pillowcase that has been washed and thoroughly rinsed so that all sizing and detergent is out of that pillowcase. But a pillowcase can also work for you, excuse me, to squeeze out your juice from. We already talked about pasteurizing. Store cider in the refrigerator for immediate use or for up to about 5 days. If you want your cider to last longer than that, you will want to choose to freeze it to keep it longer. And then again, be sure to use strong sound glass bottles that are not going to break during the fermentation, because those gases are going to build up in there. We do have a document on the Bedford County page that will give you directions on how to make apple cider if you choose to do that. I am now going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Patsy Watkins, and she is going to share with us some other methods for apple preservation. Hey, Patsy.
Sorry, can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. I'm going to talk to you about freezing apples. A lot of people really do like frozen apples. I think it's a great way for preserving them. And when you do want to freeze them, you know, some people are afraid of canning, or they don't have the equipment to can, or they don't have the right kind of stove. So you can freeze. Again, you want to select full flavored apples that are really crisp and they're firm in their texture when you're freezing them. And again, we talked about there are a lot of varieties, and Anita told you about a place to find that, but you can find out which ones are firm in texture. So you want to wash them, peel them, and core them. And they're with their apple cores that you can use. There are also a kind of a machine that you can use that's an apple core, and it will peel them and do them in rings. And so thin rings is also a way to work when you're freezing. But if you're just slicing them, you want it to be really thin slices. So like a medium apple, you would do it in 12ths, and a really large apple, you would do it in 16ths. So again, that is, you know, thin little slices. Now, if you're going to use these apples to make pies, a sugar pack or a dry pack is the best method. But if you're going to use these apples for like an uncooked dessert or like in a fruit cocktail or something, a syrup pack is what is preferred. So how do you make a sugar or dry pack? Well, the first thing, we want to make sure these apples don't brown. You know how apples turn brown. So you would use a half a teaspoon of ascorbic acid, and that's like a vitamin C product, in 3 tablespoons of water. And then you would sprinkle that over your fruit just to prevent browning. If you don't want to do that, you can put them like in a double boiler and steam blanch them for like 1.5 to 2 minutes. So it's not very long, but you would steam blanch them. So then you take a half a cup of sugar and put it with a quart of fruit, and a quart of fruit is about 1.25 pounds of fruit. And you would mix that together. And of course, sugar tends to bring out the juices in your apple. And then you pack those apples into containers, you know, pressing the fruit down because you don't want to leave a lot of air in there. And you leave about a half an inch of head space, because it will expand a little bit when it's frozen, for either pints or quarts. It's the same for both of them. And then you seal them and you freeze them. You can use freezer jars. They're also tempered jars, but they have kind of a different top than the two kind of top. They have like a plastic top. They also make freezer containers, which are really heavy duty plastic, and they make extra heavy duty like freezer bags. And then there are also some vacuum seal products that you can use too for freezing. Now, if you're going to do a dry pack, you do it about the same way. You do it the very same way as far as your headspace and packing, but you omit the sugar. But another thing you can also do is you can put those slices out on a cookie sheet or a tray, and you can freeze them first, and then you can individually put those frozen pieces into your jar or your bag, and you can freeze them. So now if you want to do a syrup pack, how do you make syrup? Well, you use a cold 40% syrup. And again, you've got to prevent the browning. And so you'll put that half a teaspoon of ascorbic acid into each quart of the syrup. So this 40% syrup is what we call a heavy syrup. That means it has a lot of sugar to water. So it's a heavy concentration. So you put 2 3/4 cups of sugar in lukewarm water, and you mix until the solution is clear. And then you chill the syrup before you're using it. And then you put these, you start with a half a cup of this heavy syrup, and then you slice the apples directly into that syrup. That's for a pint container, directly into the syrup. And then you press that fruit down. You make sure it's kind of tight in those containers, and add enough syrup to cover the top of it, leaving some headspace. But to make sure this fruit stays in the syrup and doesn't like float up into the headspace, you crumple like parchment paper or some other kind of water resistant paper into it to make sure, to kind of fill up that headspace and make sure that the fruit stays down, holds the fruit down, and then you seal it and you freeze it. So that's how you do a syrup pack. And then another great way to preserve apples is to dry them. And I don't know about you guys, but I remember growing up and my mom would make fruit pies, and she used dried fruit to make those fruit pies. And it was real intense and really good fruit. So if you want to dry your apples, again, you select the fresh, firm, fully ripe apples. And a couple of really good varieties are like Fuji or Pink Lady. They tend to make your dried fruit taste like you've added sweetener because they're so sweet. So it's really good. You can also use some Honey Crisp and some Golden Delicious. There are other varieties that are good. And so again, you wash, core, slice, however you want to do this with them. Really thin. You want to have really, really thin slices for drying because, you've got to get all that moisture out. You put them in that ascorbic acid solution and soak them for a few minutes so they, to kind of help with the browning. And then you arrange this well-drained fruit on drying trays in single layers. And like you may have a food dehydrator, which is probably your best way. There are some other ways for drying, but the most convenient, particularly nowadays in our kitchens, is just to get a food dehydrator, and it has several trays. And you put them on single layers, and you dry it at 140 degrees for about 5 hours. And you check near the end of that for dryness. And one of the ways you check for dryness is you take out this hot fruit and you let it cool a little bit, because when it's cool, it will seem more pliable and moister than it might actually be. Let it cool a bit, and then you kind of pinch it or, try to fold it and see if it's pliable and if there's any moisture left on your hands. If there's still some moisture, you put it back in to dry a little longer. If there's not, then you can take it out. And then you have to condition the fruit for 4 to 10 days. And conditioning is just packing this fruit about 2/3 full loosely in like a plastic container or a glass container. And you just and that helps to keep it from getting really moist or get the more moisture out and from molding. And so you just kind of shake it up for 4 to 10 days and you watch. And if you see moisture beads forming, then you may need to put it back in the dryer a little bit and then try the conditioning again. And once it's completely dry, you pack them in small amounts in some dry glass jars. And these glass jars, it would be good if they were dark. Also, they need to be, sterilized. So you scald them, boiling water, or you can put them in freezer containers, boxes, or bags. And dried apples last about 6 to 12 months. Then if you want to use these, they're great to use dried apples like on granola, in some salads and some meat dishes, whatever you want to use them in. But if you want to, like cook them or reconstitute them, then it's about 15 minutes in boiling water. And then they're, kind of ready to use. So that is your dried apples. And Fruit leather is also a type of drying, but it's pureed fruit. And so some quick facts about fruit leather is you dry thin layers of this pureed fruit in the oven. You can do it in your oven, takes a long time, probably uses a lot of electricity, or a dehydrator. It dries in 4 to 10 hours. Again, that 140 to 145. And then properly dried fruit leather is translucent, like you see in this picture here, and slightly tacky to the touch, but it's easily peeled from your pan. Now it gets the name leather from the fact that dried puree is shiny and has the texture of leather. And fruit leather is also called fruit rolls or taffies, and it's a really nutritious, high energy snack for adults and for children. Now, you think about commercially fruit roll-ups, and that is kind of a type of fruit leather, but you can make your own fruit leather. Now, we do need to remember that all dried fruit is not necessarily low calorie, because obviously that sugar in the fruit is concentrated when you dry it. And so, it does have a lot of sugar, okay? But you can select with your fruit leather, you select ripe or slightly overripe fruit. You wash the fruit. Again, you remove the peel, the seeds, and the stem, and you cut it into chunks, and then you puree it until smooth, and you use about 2 cups of fruit for every kind of like a cookie sheet size of either 13 by 15 or 12 by 17, which is, a pretty good size cookie sheet. You can add 2 teaspoons of lemon juice or 1/8 a teaspoon of ascorbic acid for each 2 cups of your light colored fruit to prevent the darkening. Now, you can sweeten your fruit leather if you don't think it's sweet enough. And you might want to add corn syrup or honey for longer storage because it prevents crystals. If you use sugar, just regular sugar, it does crystals. And so you don't over a long period of time. So you just only want to use sugar if you're going to have an immediate use or just a really short storage time. You're going to use about 1/4 to 1/2 cup of sweetener for each 2 cups of your fruit. And you can also use saccharin-based sweeteners. They can be used to reduce the tartness without adding calories, but aspartame, if you use aspartame, that tends to lose its sweetness over time, okay? If you're going to store fruit leather, it will store in your freezer for about a year, in the refrigerator for about 3 to 4 months, or maybe 6 months, and then on your shelf for 1 to 2 months. You can spray cookie sheets with a vegetable spray or line it with a plastic wrap and spread that fruit concentrate really evenly to about 1/8 to 1/4 inch of depth. And 2 cups will cover, one of these 12 by 17 or 13 by 15 cookie sheets, and dry it again in the oven or dehydrator for 140 to 145 minutes. And a lot of times if you've got one of these big cookie sheets, that's why you're having to do it in the oven, because your dehydrator is not large enough. When it's ready, you loosen the edge of the leather from the pan, and it should come up really easily if it's done. And you loosely roll it in a plastic wrap or wax paper in just like one big piece. You just kind of roll it one big piece. And you can either store it in that one big piece, or you can cut it in those 1-inch strips. And then you could roll those strips, and you could actually put them in a bag or a jar and store them that way long term. And like I said, you can store it in a cool, dry, dark place in your refrigerator or your freezer. And I already told you how long it will last in your freezer and your refrigerator. So anybody have any questions about those or about anything we've talked about? Anita, I can give it back to you.
Oh, well, for either one of us. So I'm going to stop recording.